Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the still unnamed show that I've started. And today I have with me Mr. Jeff Sanders, a good friend of mine. How you doing, Jeff?
One day closer to heaven, brother.
Glad to hear it. So, Jeff, you and I have been friends for a couple of years now, and I've been following you. You're pretty much the closest thing I know to a celebrity because you're a famous journalist. But I'll let you introduce yourself. Go ahead.
My name's Jeff Sanders. I am a freelance contributor to the Epoch Times. I'm based in Surrey. We don't really have newsrooms anymore, which is a bit of a problem, but you have stringers all across Canada. I'm the only one here in BC at the moment. And yeah, when I have the opportunity, I pitch stories. I end up getting approved for some of them. I do the legwork, the content, submit it, and then it becomes their property and they decide whether or not to publish it. And they usually do. I studied journalism in Vancouver. It was about 35 years ago. And I had a couple of awesome jobs early on for my local community newspaper and a wire service covering Vancouver Canucks games and other things that they might need here. And then I had a break for a couple of decades before getting back into it, just because I was disgusted with how journalism had become so disreputable. It had fallen off the cliff, and there's never too many sharks for it to jump. So getting back into this was sort of my way to try and bring some integrity back, and I hope that I have, but I think I can also be a victim to some of the bad habits that are going on in the industry now too. So here we are.
So you and I, just everything, the way that things unfolded the last few years, we've kind of talked about the state of Canada, and then I followed you twice as you were on the National Citizens Inquiry, first as a witness, and you kind of gave this thesis. So I'm not going to do it justice, but you kind of are saying that the media is being dishonest, and it's a big driver of what everything that's going on in Canada. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to give you as much time as you want to explain to us what you think is happening.
Yeah. So my opinion of how journalism has declined since I was in the industry, again, before I got back into it, of course, we used to have, we'd be dispatched a story, and then as a reporter, you would try to balance as many different angles that would make it relevant. So I remember one time there was a winery in Surrey that was closing. They called a press conference. They were moving to another location. They gave their reasons. I can't remember what they were, but it'd be things like they couldn't rezone some of their property, taxes were too high. They found larger land in a more tax friendly community, something like that. And they give their point of the issue. I would go and find the other side, which would be, in this case, the city, get their comments on what was going wrong, maybe try to see where the affected workers were. There might be a union. There's other locals that probably benefited, maybe some distributors. And you can package all those interviews and research into an article that you as a reader would then see the balance between it. You can decide whether there was a side you wanted to take, if at all, and move on with your day. The same story, if that were to happen today, it would be, depending on the media outlet, you would get one side or the other. So the winery is leaving, and my media outlet has a problem with the city or the government, and therefore we're going to highlight everything that makes their departure valid. And we might get a comment from the city, but then we're going to taper it so it looks a little bit less credible. And you, as the reader, will come away as backing the winery. Or the other side would be, we're in favor of what the government was doing. It makes a lot of sense to us because of whatever reason. We announce that they're leaving, but then we find people that are going to be more critical of that. And that's how pretty much every story is covered now. We do see some quality journalism on issues that don't have as much political nature to them, but it's still part of the business. One of the other things that has affected journalism is how a media outlet would choose stories. And so, again, depending on your outlet, I mean, we saw Epoch Times is a great example. Their subscriptions grew tremendously during the Freedom Convoy because we're the virtually the only outlet in Canada that was covering it. And there's people that knew there was something important about this convoy, and outlets across the world were already paying attention to it. But our big mainstream media outlets here in Canada were just ignoring the whole story, and it's kind of an illustration of even in our own country, we are putting things in a particular order. And that has a lot to do with the readership or the viewership. They now kind of demand certain coverage on items more than others. So that would be a great example might be Donald Trump. He is very polarizing, and depending on your audience, they'll want to hear all the bad stuff or how he's the greatest president of all time type of thing, and you feed that demographic that's been established. As the internet has grown and more media outlets have kind of entered the landscape, this is one of the other things that have kind of taken away the broader approach journalism once used to have. So there would be a 6 o'clock newscast, and people would watch the news, or they would tune in to the news radio broadcast when they're driving their car. We had these patterns of reading the paper in the morning or at work. Those are gone now largely because we can get news whenever we want it. But we're now tapering where we're getting that news based on what our itchy ears want to hear. And so the credibility of journalism, I'm arguing, has declined because what used to be a story to all the media outlets in Canada is no longer that. I have a great example. When I would be driving my commercial vehicle, I used to listen to National Post Radio on satellite at 4 a.m. out here in Vancouver. They would kind of give me a catch up of all the Canadian content of the stuff that happened the previous day. But on Fridays, they would have a different host, and it was always somebody that would have a more progressive spin or viewpoint on what constituted news. And the daily producer was also in that frame. So I remember listening to, I guess, a press conference that Donald Trump gave, and it was on infrastructure. And I was just shaking my head. Like, the reporter questions were just brutal. Like, it's like, how far down the ladder has our industry descended? It was just embarrassing. Well, later that night, there was a terrorist attack in Spain where Canadians died. It was an emerging story, but by 4 a.m. on the Pacific coast, there was enough to at least tell all of Canada that this terrible thing had happened and Canadians were affected. Yet on this particular broadcast, they led with Donald Trump is a racist and we finally have proof. And that infrastructure press conference that I listened to live was the there's good people on both sides famous quote that came from it. And I couldn't remember, like, what did he say? I listened to the whole thing, and I went back, read the transcript. I still couldn't figure it out. And yet this would be like a clear example of how, as a producer or an editor, you can determine what your audience is going to have for news. So when these things continued to pile up and I was just getting sick of it, I thought about getting back into the industry on a part-time basis. I found Epic Times, in my opinion, seemed to have the most credibility. and I didn't meet the standards that they were asking for. But then again, there aren't a lot of people who study journalism that actually get into journalism anymore either. So my approach in my interview was good enough for the editor, and that was about 2.5 years ago. And yeah, I've been with them ever since. And I've had to take a break during the summer, but I'm getting back going into it now. So that's sort of my approach to the NCI, was to say that the chaos and division we've had in our country is largely the responsibility of the media. And if they had been appropriate in how they approached everything related to COVID, to mandates, to government response, there was an easier way to illustrate to the country everything that made each of those decisions, each of these issues understandable, and we would not have created the enemies among all of us that we still have today. They're the ones that are responsible. The government can do anything they want, but when the media isn't holding them accountable for it, then they keep creating whatever policies or making decisions or saying inflammatory things that end up further dividing our nation, our viewer, their in the media business, the viewers, the listeners, and so on. And my approach was to try and illustrate how journalism has descended, what types of things they do to mislead their audiences, and how it has contributed to the chaos that we've ended up having to endure the past few years. And of course, if they had been professional all along, as Canada used to always be back when I studied it, and for probably a good 20 years after, that's gone now. But if they maintain their professionalism, our nation would not have had the problems that we've ended up with during these past few years. That's my take anyway. And that's what I wanted to convey at the NCI.
I'm gonna. I do this on on this show. At least I did in the last episode. I ask like I bring a guest on and they talk forever, and I ask the most ridiculously stupid questions. So
No.
apologies beforehand, but I'm trying to get an understanding of what the media is. Just very high level, very basic. So to me, the media, they're sort of like freelance investigators. So you could think of a crime has been committed, $1 million is missing at City Hall, or counselor has had her salary frozen. So you send these like special forces sort of investigators in, and they piece everything together. They have the time to actually ask the questions, and then they package a product. That product happens to be the reason, the explanation, and if they're good at their job, we the consumers we purchase that product through advertisements indirectly. Um, is that is that accurate, or is the media supposed to be doing something completely different?
Yeah, Payman, I think you're grasping onto the. It's a great analogy, by the way, but that was what it was like before. It's not like that today. The media landscape does not generate typically the revenue that they used to rely on, because as much media is available out there, so are the advertising dollars, and it gets filtered through so many different layers. We don't have many newsrooms anymore where we're in a place with a bunch of editors and reporters, a dozen people taking phone calls, writing stories. Our newsroom is our bedroom or our office, our car, and we don't even know largely any of the other people that we work with except for maybe our editor or a couple of them. We don't have the investigative journalism availability anymore because a lot of those pieces would take a week or longer to produce. Are you going to pay somebody a full-time salary when they're only giving content once a week? I mean, that is one of the tough decisions that kind of comes into play. So when you don't get paid very much in this job, and if you're getting paid by the story, then you need to find ways to get more stories out there so that you can afford your mortgage and your groceries and anything else that comes along the way. And so, how do you do that? Uh, you have to cut corners. And a lot of times, 30 years ago, we would spend all day on one story and then it would get published. And we could afford to live off of that to some degree. Today, it'll be one press release, maybe one interview, and that's kind of your analysis of what happened. Where the way you put it together there, when we're trying to find all the moving parts of the crime, we're only going to rely on one person, maybe two, to tell us what happened. And that takes away some of the, uh, some of the way we can add more nuance to what that crime really was, if it even was a crime. So today, the crime happens, I think, Payman, like you described, but we're going to rely on the police report and just break it down, get it published in a few hours, and then we'll get dispatched the next crime and try and do the same thing. It's one of the problems that has plagued journalism largely because we don't have the time and the money to dedicate to finding all of the different angles that come into play to help illustrate this crime. And by only referring to one person, maybe two, and not doing the research, somebody's already branded as guilty, and we have no idea whether that may be actually true or not. And people get smeared all the time. And that's where that expression trial by Twitter came from. We get one piece of information, and then all of our followers and people that we're attached to on social media, we keep echoing the same talking point, and it's usually just one talking point. And we're seeing that with Israel and Gaza right now. We saw it with Ukraine and Russia. We saw it with the vaccines. We see it with Trump. We see it with Soji. And there's a lot more balance that needs to be brought into it, but the media doesn't do that. And of course, social media makes it even worse.
So you said you just gave an example. Like 30 years ago, everybody would work on one story. So I take that and I interpret that as there was money back then to spend on people to sit and work and work and work and investigate and then release a story in a couple of days or weeks. What's changed now? That is the money spread too thin among way too many freelancers that everyone's just trying to get the story out as quickly as possible to pay the mortgage, as you said?
That's what I think is the big thing. You have you have a lot of advertising opportunity, and it's that would probably be argued as well that that has decreased. But when you're competing with those advertising dollars through so many different competing media outlets, if you're London Drugs, how much are you going to spread out there? You're going to find your demographic and tailor it just to that demographic. And so one of the things that has come up is when an editor is going to be making decisions, they have to balance how much time and how much money it's going to cost in order to try and make this story, viable. One of the things my editor asked me was to cover the BC United leadership convention. And I told him, well, it's about a 4 or 5 hour drive away from me. Do you want to cover the cost of that? And he's like, probably not. That's the type of thing that comes into play. The federal government has created some incentives and opportunities for media outlets in order to get federal taxpayer money to stay afloat, to hire a reporter full time for a year. And there's other initiatives that they've also put into play. And that doesn't include the money that goes towards the CBC, which used to serve, by the way, a very useful, like down here in Vancouver, we had lots of access to news, both here in Canada and the United States. But you start going up north, they relied on the CBC for virtually everything if they didn't have satellite dishes. Now that the whole country has access to almost anything, you know, their role has sort of shifted from informing everybody in the country to finding ways to retain audience, to give certain demographics their, what they're requiring, how to provide entertainment and other sort of national sort of funded initiatives. So the CBC gets a lot of money already, and with that part of being what was always the mandate, they don't need to do that as much anymore because the whole country can get their news and information through the internet. But you throw that $1 billion price tag down as well. We have a lot of money that the federal governments have put towards media outlets to try and keep them afloat. But there is a consequence with that as well, as others that I've talked to in the industry have found that their media outlets have actually been catering to very friendly coverage of federal government policies and mandates, issues, that type of thing. So money has clouded that. Yeah, I think it is spread too thin. There's too much out there, and it does make it tough for a company or a media outlet to have a staff large enough to do the legwork that would once make a story one we would expect. Now we just want to hear more or less what we want to hear, and that's why we go to where we go to.
That actually ties in perfectly to what I was going to ask. I'm increasingly, since pretty much December of 2020, I've just grown more and more frustrated with what's going on with the country, and so I've decided to run for the PPC. I figure I can't ask other people to save my country if I'm not willing to do it myself. So to that end, I'm trying to be more like trying to come up with solutions. And I've noticed that the socialists are just running circles around us regular people. So what's happening is we have private media ish in Canada, but they're going to say that because there's not enough money, we're not getting good quality news content. We're getting what do they call it? Disinformation. So what they're going to do is, well, what we should do is we should pool the money, give it to the government, and then the government gives it out, and that way we'll have the best, most objective news. Of course, that's not going to work. I mean, we see what's happening with the CBC, but my question is, how do we get ahead of that? Because this whole thing of confronting these people on the left, I'm calling them socialist progressives, it doesn't really work. As what's that expression? They have an answer for everything and a solution for nothing. So what is the solution for fixing this media rut?
I have thought about this a lot. Uh, I mean, the tradition of consuming news has changed. I mentioned we used to watch news at 6 o'clock at home. We would read the morning newspaper. When we're in the car, we would catch the top of the hour newscast. And they were all very much approaching giving us that news in the same way. A terrorist attack in Spain where Canadians were killed would be the lead in every one of those 30 years ago. But it's not like that now. I wonder if the money that is being given to our media outlets from the government, if that tap was turned off, they would have to face the reality of how to provide news to their customers and still stay afloat. There's quite a few media outlets that have not received government money, and they're subscription based largely. Would they have to turn to that to get their consumers? My guess is they probably would lose a lot of viewers and readers. My my hope would be that they would go back to reporting news appropriately, and then culturally we would start consuming it in a way that we used to 20 and 30 years ago and beyond. The presence on social media, where our younger generations, and I'm in my 50s, so that's probably 30 and under now, but a lot of their news content comes from what's fed to them via their, I guess, their TikToks and Instagrams and things like that. And culturally, those platforms are determining what constitutes news as well. And so they're being fed what their social media sites are deciding they need to know. And this is probably one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of people passionately protest in our streets regarding things going on in Israel or Russia or Soji as examples. I don't have an answer except that if we're going to try and get, I don't want to say legitimate news, but just more balanced news out there and make it part of the culture again, we have to find a way to get the social media element involved. And I'm not sure that's easy to do because that's probably more resources that a news outlet has to dedicate in order to try and get that news out there. And even then it might not reach its viewers or listeners or you know telephone people. But I mean, cutting the tap off of funding it with government money is, I think, the first step that would definitely get a lot of these outlets to look themselves in the mirror to try to figure out how to stay afloat. And that might bring back a little more balance in how news is covered. It's a tough one, brother. I don't know what to say as an answer, especially that the whole aspect of consuming news has become a complete change to what I was used to. And when I first entered this industry, the decline of the community newspaper is really tragic. That served our communities in an incredible way. I found when I used to write for my local paper, and that was in a pretty big city too. So the small town feel, like where people are important, and that flavor is definitely being lost. So I wish I could give you a better answer, but definitely finding a way to get a better presence on social media is one of the bigger things that is going to be necessary if we're going to move back into that realm of credibility. But I still don't know if that's going to work.
I'm I'm actually 40 now, so I guess I'm 10 years younger than you. Um, but I'm coming to the conclusion that government is the problem, so it can't be the solution. And we don't have to pivot to this right now, but the was it Bill 44? Which bill is it right now that they're mandating certain density around public transit?
Okay, yes, you're talking about in BC here. Um, yeah, I can't recall. I did write a story on bills 43 and 44, and that that was from a year ago, and that had to do with things on giving the federal, or sorry, the provincial government authority to start mandating municipalities to increase their development, as well as taking away things from condos being owner occupiers, a bunch of things to what they thought might create more units. The one that you're talking about, I haven't explored, so I'm not going to comment on it with anything, with any type, like as if I've explored it or written on it yet. But I know that this is a recent approach that our provincial government here in BC is looking toward. And my interpretation is that because housing is such a big issue in BC, they're going to need to get some wins, um, especially in case the disaster that's become healthcare in BC becomes, an anchor for them. At least they'll be able to point to all of the initiatives they were taking to try and address the housing problem here.
Yeah, it's So I'm going to pull on that thread. I feel like government has created this problem. Maybe they didn't intend to, but there's so much bureaucracy. We had to do some cleanup on our property. My family they do some small scale development, and we had to get so many permits. And the one that really broke my back was we had to get a fence. They told us we had to put a fence around a tree so that when we're getting rid of the garbage, we don't damage the tree. Like, to me, that's just absurd. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. They create this problem, so there's not enough housing. They bring in a million immigrants, which is not. I mean, it's going to exacerbate the problem. And then we, the people, turn to the government. We're like, "Oh, please help us somehow." And they come up with these laws that erode our property rights, that say you must zone this much. And as you mentioned, perhaps unrelated, but they're saying you can't do this, no owner operator. So I feel this isn't really the government's fault, is what I'm saying. Like, if we were responsible adults and we figured out, we sat down, figured out what the problem is, and then came up with a solution out of it, we'd be in a better place than to ask the people that are causing the problem to fix the problem.
Yeah, this would be an issue that is sort of, if we're going to approach this from a journalistic standpoint. I mean, we may already have our own opinion on it, whether we're a homeowner or we're looking for a place to rent. I mean, right away we've created our own bias toward it, and based on the media outlet we work for, we'll probably cover that story in a way that matches what we already think. Our job in media is to look at these types of bills and scrutinize them and get comment on them. Who's affected? Why are you coming up with this? For example, you're going to make, I think one of it is up to the standard single detached home lot is now going to be rezoned for 6 homes, I think, or 6 people to occupy. So if that's one of the things there, why are you doing that? Are you going to change every neighborhood in British Columbia, or sorry, in every town that has more than 5,000 people? Tell us why. And then opposition, what do you guys say about that particular feature or some of the other ones? Because overall, they've decided to create this bill, and we as media are supposed to try and analyze it and scrutinize it. And there's other things that aren't even related to the content of the bill. It's how fast they're looking to push it through without proper debate, or at least what some of us would argue would be proper debate. There's a lot of features of everything that the government does that it's our responsibility, or it used to be, to try and figure out what all of those different angles are. And if it's more than one story, then we go to our editor and say, hey, this is how much I can cover at this time. But yeah, to speak on it from a personal standpoint, I mean, I have my opinion on it, or I could have my opinion on it, but really my job is to let you, as the consumer for news, understand what's going on, why they're doing it, what the opposition to it is, how some people are going to be affected by it, and not include my own bias while I do it. So that's where we do lack. It's a great example of how this story will probably be covered in BC, is going to talk about the housing crisis. And this is good, it's great, or people that already are homeowners and are being kind of squeezed further to, have challenges on what they're going to do with their own property. Airbnbs, I think, are being moved out, and, um, you know, different things that you might do with your vacation home and stuff like that. So, but my job is to try and present it all in a package that covers all the sides. So as of right now, Payman, I don't have an opinion on um, this issue.
That's fine. That's fine. And I think I was kind of leading the witness there. What about? I want to present a different view of journalism. So before I said you guys are kind of investigators. So as an investigator or detective, you have to be completely objective. What about if instead we thought of you guys as like advocates? So um, you, I go to the media sources. I know my absolute truth. So if I believe, in private business ownership or private property rights, I'm going to go to the news outlets that go, approach a story with that point of view. I'm not saying that you go absolutely insane and start manufacturing evidence, or stubbornly refuse to change any of your positions. But is there any room for that? Because right now, like the any media that's left leaning and a very left leaning obviously endorses enlargement of the government. If we treat it like a war, shouldn't we endorse governments, media that endorses private ownership, individual rights, sort of thing?
Well, you have that option now. I think you're going to find media outlets that will cater to your points of view on things, and they will cover stories that other outlets might not, because your position on a variety of issues, the media outlets you've chosen will do that. The problem I find is they also will only cover one side of the story. So, as an example, I covered a drag queen story time in at the Coquitlam Library, and there was about 20 or so people there to protest, and the pro drag queen story time uh, coalition had, I think they probably had about 200 supporters that came out. And as I talked to both sides, I would always ask them, do you understand why, the protester is here on the other side of the lane? Or do you understand why the counter protester is here on the other side of the lane? Not one person I asked at that event had any idea what the other's point of view was. And to me, that was saying something very descriptive about how our media behaves on all of these touchy issues, and not even an issue that has maybe traditional controversy. You get fed based on where you go, whether it's just your TikTok or if it's CBC or Epoch Times. You're getting an angle largely that only tells you the side of the story that we now want to hear, and that's why we go to these places. I don't think that's good for our society anymore, because we see this, the people who were protesting it, they were getting physically assaulted while I was there, not like beaten up, but we have seen examples where that has happened in places with maybe some of these really touchy issues. But they were being pushed around, and they had loudspeakers in their ears and so on. It was, you know, it's a product of us keep getting fed the same sort of talking points. And again, my illustration that we should be providing a better picture of what's really going on, even if somebody is strongly, in favor of drag queen story time or strongly opposed, they can still be in that position afterward. But if they're going to go and protest or counter protest one of these things, they don't have any idea what the other side is there for. That didn't, I'm not going to say it didn't entirely be the case, but we used to have a lot more responsibility in presenting what that is. So again, I mean, you can go to those media outlets that are going to feed you what you want to hear, or give you the stories that are going to be more of interest to you. Certainly the algorithms with our YouTube and Facebook and things like that probably already know what we want to read and hear, so they keep giving us more content like that. It is damaging though, because we're now hating each other, and we're really a lot closer to a lot of these issues than we realize. Like in the whole thing with drag queen story time and Soji, for example, both sides I know believe they are there to help and protect children, and it's stunning for each side to think that that's what the other side is there for. But we don't give that enough attention when we're writing our stories or we're putting our podcasts together. And so, yeah, I'm not going to say for what that I agree that we should have news media that is going to be unbalanced and that, but It's already there. We can go to it if we want. I just don't like that we do.
Fair enough. Seems like a hard no. For the record, I don't entirely believe what I said. I read it. I heard about it on a podcast. Um,
Mhm.
what about this? What if I said that the problem it's actually bigger than the media? So the media is exacerbating it, but if there's no foundation, if there's no base, take the Emergency Measures Act and the bank freeze. So people on the left, mostly on the left, even in the center, they hated the truckers. Okay, fine, you have contempt for them. I get that. And then the deputy prime minister freezes their bank accounts, and I had a wicked hard time explaining to people why that was wrong, and I never got through to anyone. And I think what's happening is people, they've forgotten that that money that's in the bank, that's your money. It's not the bank's money, and it's definitely not the government's money. But if we don't have that foundation, if people don't understand that, um, it's either not the media's fault or the media can just run wild with it and to explain it, convince people of anything. Like, well, what do you think of that?
The Freedom Convoy was definitely pivotal in our country. The whole world was talking about the truckers, and you know, our media feeds were helping us be resolved on one side or the other. And so you're right in that there's a portion of our country that were absolutely behind the truckers convoy, and there was an equal amount that was completely against it. What doesn't happen anymore is we can't discuss what makes an issue controversial in a civil manner anymore. I think it was around 25 years ago when the North American Free Trade Agreement was first signed. And if I wanted to know more about it, we would have, talk show hosts that would talk about it. Maclean's Magazine would have a story on it. There'd be updates in our daily newspapers every once in a while, and then I would form an opinion. You would do the same thing, and then we'd be having a beer and we'd start talking about it, and I'm in favor and you aren't, and I'd kind of make my arguments and you'd make your arguments, and we're still friends at the end of it. And I respect why you disagree with it. You understand why I support it. It all makes sense. However, when they recrafted that North American Free Trade Agreement a few years ago, the way you and I would discuss it now, because we don't do any research on it, and this is a cultural issue, I would say, how can you not support it? And you would say, what? How can you support it? And then my big argument would be, well, F you. And then your big argument would say, well, F you too. And then we're not friends anymore. And we spill our beer and we go find somebody else to hang out with. So we don't have a way to take some of these really big controversial issues, and everything's controversial now, it seems, anyways, because there's a political angle to all of it, and we can't communicate it. It's a slow drip for people to change their opinion on anything anymore. One of the things I kind of look at are the comment sections on whatever. You take the Emergencies Act. I Right after the report was given, I took a look at four different media outlets in Canada and how they covered it, and then I looked at the comment sections, and you can see, the people that are going to these news outlets, what their large base really is. So you're looking about talking about a bank account being frozen, and you're saying that that's not the government's money. Who are they to freeze it? Well, if I'm going to report on it, my job would be to explain why, like putting this Emergency Measures Act in place, why bank accounts could be frozen. But instead, what we tend to do is we'll frame that part of the story and we'll have somebody whose account that was frozen that no longer can pay rent or buy groceries or something like that, to show how much of an overreach the government had performed. Or we would use just the wording that justifies why that is in place and paint it in a positive manner, so that our viewers, our readers, will end up supporting why it was done in the first place. you know Again, I have an opinion on that for sure, but if I'm reporting on it, I'm not supposed to bring that in. And this is one of the challenges that I face as a reporter, and every other one in my industry does as well. It's because we're now given a lot more of a leash to craft our stories and our interviews that are going to paint the news consumer to support what we're trying to convey. And we were never meant to do that. So, I mean, again, I have an opinion, but I'm hoping I can illustrate to anybody that's watching your podcast that my job is really to give you the sides of where this issue is, and then you can kind of take it and run with it from there.
Yeah. I was just I'm laughing. I was thinking about something while you were explaining that to me. Again, going back to the foundation thing,
The
I feel like
foundation of what?
everything's, let's say government, for example. Like
Right.
if you ask someone, even me, like what's the purpose of government, a lot of us can't answer that. I compare everything to Monopoly. Like in Monopoly, you have the rule book, right? It's only, I don't know, a dozen or so pages long. It's written in plain English. You can read it, and there's no ambiguity. Now, I'm 1867. Probably our government was something like that. Now it's just gotten so out of control that if you park your car on a highway, that constitutes terrorism, essentially. So I understand there's a need for that. You just can't block critical infrastructure. But I feel like everything is slipping away from people. If we don't understand what the purpose of government is, um, I don't think it's fair to hold media like you completely accountable.
I
Yet,
disagree.
you do have to pander to it.
No, I
Okay, go
disagree,
ahead.
Payman. What I see happening now is the federal government is working to create measures and laws that are going to restrict what we're allowed to say. And it's already been happening. Now, not that I'm saying that I support this or anything, but just as an example, our federal government, all parties agreed that to deny the Holocaust is illegal. We're not allowed to have a platform where we can question the Holocaust anymore. So, is that a good thing or is it not? Well, I mean, we don't want to, I would argue, just like they would as politicians, that we shouldn't, you know, pretend that what happened what didn't happen or was irrelevant, or take away what was serious about it. But the problem is, once we start determining what constitutes safe speech, we're now going to be expanding it. So when they came up with the MAID program, which is the, assisted suicide or medical assistance in dying, they had a lot of concerns from Canadians and politicians. And so they had these very strict boundaries on how that was going to be administered. Now it just keeps expanding to pretty soon. I mean, I don't know where the stop is going to be, but every time it's being brought up, they're expanding those goalposts so more and more people are able to take their lives. The same thing's happening with speech. And Trudeau did a couple of town hall type appearances in within 2 days, and both times he brought up flat Earth and saying it's not that it's necessarily hurting anybody, but that type of misinformation can lead, and I'm summarizing, but that type of misinformation can lead to some breakdowns in how we view the world and our country, and we need to kind of keep that in mind. And now that the CRTC has already taken away the platforms of Facebook and I guess YouTube and some of the Google, whatever, that they don't post news stories anymore, that's one of the first steps that they're taking to, you know, decide what is going to be on our airwaves. They also have given the CRTC the authority, if they want, to determine what is going to be safe for broadcasting. So my fear is we've given the government uh, too much sway, or we've just allowed them to parrot their point of view, their policies, without giving them adequate pushback, to where now we're going to be in an era where they're going to appoint somebody that decides what is misinformation. And there's nobody that has asked the government, and I've heard our health ministry say the same thing during the COVID crisis, is rely on the sources we tell you on where you get your information, not anybody else. And my question is, well, who's going to police the government when they're the ones that are giving the misinformation? And it is largely them that are guilty of that. But the government is being given this freedom to keep expanding the boundaries of all of this. And if we were doing our job, then the Canadian public would recognize that the government has overreached on everything that they've been doing, but they're doing it for our own good and safety, I suppose they would argue. And when we're scared of what's around the corner, of course, we're going to endorse it because, like you say, the government can create the problem because they're the ones that have to fix it. And we remember after 9/11, that gave the government this really overreaching effort with the Patriot Act to spy on everybody. And we don't even know about it. And who knows how far they're going in Canada as well. So, yeah, I got to say that it is the media's fault. If the media was doing its job and giving at least, by the way, not only we have examples here. We had a premier back in the 90s named Glenn Clark, who his big scandal was that he gave a political favor to a neighbor who built his deck, something along those lines there. That cost him his job as premier. Gordon Campbell, who was a premier afterward, he ended up getting a drunk driving or at least charge in Hawaii. That was very embarrassing for the party. But it was when he lied about the HST, or the harmonized sales tax, that he had to step down. The Trudeau government has at least 5 ethics violations that they're guilty of and counting, not to mention some of the overreach that we can argue with getting that Nova Scotia shooting tragedy politicized with the RCMP. Of course, the Emergencies Act is another one that looks like people still have their opinions on, but we're still supporting him largely and his government, even though that these scandals have happened. Why are they not facing the same accountability from the public anymore? And that, again, I'm laying on the feet of the media, because we're giving them largely a very soft um, presentation of what they've done, that's been wrong, that's been corrupt, and then they can just come out and just say, well, you know what, I've learned from it, and I'll make sure I don't do it again. And our government's going to take steps to be more accountable later on. And of course, we just recently had them shut down the committee that was going to investigate. I think that whole was it that gun tragedy in Nova Scotia. I mean, they're blocking it there. Like, one scandal used to be enough for a government, and now you can do anything you want because the media, again, my argument, the media is giving them a free pass on everything that they do that is illegal, unethical, or or completely, for the detriment of our country. Yeah, it's I'm sorry I kind of went off on that tangent there, but that is another important point of how the media has been irresponsible on, holding government accountable, which was always what we learned on day one in journalism school, for Pete's sakes. Not anymore. And you kind of mentioned talking about the media as being advocates as well. I would say that what's happening, people are not getting into the industry because they enjoy writing or there's something that's always attracted to them about political science or current events. They're getting into it now, it looks to me, because they're activists. They see an opportunity to take what they think is politically important or socially important or culturally important and have a bigger platform to be able to do it. And so they're not bringing in people, or they're not training people to have this neutral approach, what we used to have, but rather to allow their cultural and political bias, be amplified in whichever area they want to go with. And so this is another problem that the industry has, is that the activism in journalism has definitely grown as well.
So yeah, I think you're right. I was wrong. The media, I see what you're saying. It's an institution that's sort of abdicated its role as what is it called, the fourth branch of government, and so no one's really keeping government accountable.
But I'll tell you, Payman, the
I want to
ones
be.
that the ones that we would argue aren't keeping government accountable will say they're doing legitimate journalism. I disagree, but we all will point to somebody else and say that they're not doing their job professionally. And then they'll point to me and they'll say, you're not doing your job professionally. It's like we're living in this fantasy land where we think that we're all professional and everything is completely balanced and unbiased. Total crock. That's not true whatsoever. And we've strayed so far outside the professional margins that we were supposed to work within, that now we think whatever we do is right, and the other guy, because we play hall monitor a lot too, and we can just keep pointing our fingers at them. We see that in America. It happens all the time, where the bigger media outlets will say, CNN said this, ha ha ha, what a bunch of losers, or Breitbart said this, they're totally corrupt. I mean, it's we all think we're doing it right, and we need to get some adults back in the room to kind of, I wish we could get it back with some legitimacy, because I don't think anybody thinks that the media is good. The whole fake news mantra we all agree exists. It's just not the ones we're listening to, or we're just smart enough to kind of figure out what the truth is and what isn't, and we aren't. There's a lot of tricks out there that the public doesn't realize are being done to sway our opinion when they're reading or listening to a story. So
So that's exactly where I was going with this. I'm going to be mindful of your time, so we'll wrap it up in a bit. But you said you wanted to ask me a couple of questions, basically humiliate me in front of the camera.
no, not at all. Not to
Three sets of
humiliate you.
questions based on
Yeah.
hostile, not hostile.
Yeah. Well, I'll give
So
you,
if you're ready, go ahead.
yeah, I'll give you some questions. So just to give you how an idea of how the media, depending on the outlet, would approach asking you a question about you entering politics. Okay. So there's an unfriendly question or an unfriendly media outlet, one that would be supportive of you, and then one that I would say would be the professional way or the traditional way we would have asked a question. So let's see how you, whether you can determine this. So, Payman, our country is definitely at a crossroads right now. And the Trudeau government has continued to polarize Canadians, enact policies which have been hurting our nation. And I'm looking at you, looking to get into politics. Is this what's leading you to join the PPC and run for government?
Um, the actual reason that I joined is my view has always been that if government is the problem, government can't be the solution. And I'm trying to use the PPC as a platform or springboard to get people to communicate and talk to each other and enact local solutions. Even though I'm running federally, I think the solution has to come through the people.
Hmm. As the Trudeau administration and their policies, the way they handled COVID, the truckers, has that had any implication onto what has also motivated you to get into politics?
It did, but it was more of a journey of self discovery. So the at first I was angry that they're freezing private property, but then I started researching it more and I realized I have no idea anything about political philosophy. So now that I'm getting involved, I'm trying to realign the country, to get it back on track. I just don't think more of the same is going to solve this problem. That's why I'm running. And
Hmm.
yes, the trucker convoy did have an impact.
Hmm. All right, different media outlet.
Uh
One of
oh,
the critical responsibilities of government is to protect its citizens, correct? You
incorrect.
agree with that?
I disagree with
So,
that.
yeah. So
Okay,
during the
sorry. It's one of the yes.
yeah, one of the key roles that government has to play. But during the pandemic, our government has had to enact policies. They've had to make difficult decisions in order to try and protect their constituents and all Canadians. Yet you've traveled to protests in Ottawa and in Coates, Alberta, and many others around Greater Vancouver. You even spoke at a rally that was against queer and transgendered children. So when our governments are doing their best to protect Canadians, it looks like they're also trying to protect Canadians against people like you. How do you respond?
I reject the initial premise of your question. The purpose of government is not to keep us safe. It is they are there to protect us from foreign enemies, but domestically, I think people should resolve their differences, um, one on one.
So you can see how we have different,
I see it.
how we can take the same question but frame it so that we serve it on a platter, or at least I was trying to, by making Trudeau the bad guy, then by making you the bad guy. But a more professional way to do it historically would be, Payman, you're venturing into politics. I'm sure this was a difficult decision. You have your own business that you're probably going to have to make some sacrifices for that. But what were the things that motivated you to get into politics, and why did you choose federal instead of maybe municipal or provincial?
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want to?
Well, that would be what we used to ask maybe 20 years ago. But
Right.
based on the what I was trying to show is, without going into a lot of the dirty tricks that occur in our media, when we're asking somebody a question, especially when it comes to politics, but there's all other avenues as well. We can take the same question and frame it in a way that is friendly for you, is adversarial to you, or rarely we would ask you, just tell us what your thoughts are. This happens constantly now, and you see these gotcha moments, or at least these attempts, while a reporter may be looking to get maybe something for their Twitter feed or something like this. But our media outlets, they either support Trudeau or they don't, for the most part. They're not there to report on him anymore. And the same thing is going to happen with you when you talk to somebody. They're going to either embrace you and your efforts to get into politics and maybe make some changes, or they're going to look to paint you as if you're actually dangerous to the country. This isn't what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to ask legitimate, challenging questions, but not serving them on a platter or putting you on the defensive. There's so many things that our media does that we don't recognize, but this is one of them. And I just wanted to try and give you a little illustration of a dirty trick that can be played. And that's why when I ask somebody in government or in some, depending on the institution, university or something, to speak with me on a story, they'll see who I represent and they will decide whether they're going to talk to me or not. I mean, I think I've asked the BC government, I don't know, it's dozens of times for comment or data or something. And I've maybe had one reply or two replies in 2.5 years of pursuing stories with them. Epoch Times, they don't have, the BCNDP probably doesn't have any readers of the Epoch Times. They figure, so they're not going to talk to me. And so it's no skin off of their back. If I were to go to the BC Conservative Party, they're trying to gain traction in the province. They will probably think that the Epoch Times will have a lot of potential voters or people that might support their party. So they'll talk to me probably every time that I would ask them. And this is one of the things that all journalists will face as well, is that if they're going to talk to the other side of the story, they're also going to face a lot of roadblocks with what type of access they get to people, because for good reason they don't believe that we're there with maybe a legitimate purpose to cover a story, but thinking perhaps this is designed to be a hit piece. Or if it's a friendly outlet, yeah, for sure, I'll talk to you because you'll tell all my talking points, and that's what I'm kind of counting on you to do. Uh, it's a different landscape out there, and what I was introduced to, because before, every time I approached the government, a university, a philanthropist, they didn't ask who I worked for to determine whether or not it was a safe interview or not. It's that way now. I remember Roman Bobber when he was trying to gain traction as well during the leadership convention for the Conservative Party of Canada. Like, he was taking interviews for anybody that would give them, and that included going on, you know, places like CTV and others to, you know, take his medicine, as they were there to really try and challenge him and take him down. Give credit to him. He walked into the lion's den, but you know, people have to do that when they're trying to gain some, I guess, their own sort of brand and credibility. I just wish that we would be a lot more professional in this industry, so that we weren't crafting the storyline based on what we think our audience wants or we expect them to believe.
So, where do you think we should go from here to reform the media? Do you think it's going to have to come from personal education? Is it from court cases? Is it from, choosing your media judiciously? What do we do?
Yeah. One of the people that I did study journalism with, she's worked a handful of jobs through BC. And the last one, she was the editor for two community newspapers up north. And, she had a young employee, and he just wasn't very good. He wouldn't listen to her advice. And I guess I don't know what his quality of writing was, but despite her trying to take what limited time she had to be a mentor, it wasn't making any difference. The you know the loss of the newsroom has been impactful, I think, because you're not dispatched a story from there and then you go out into the community to kind of do the gumshoe work to figure out how to get the story. Like, you sit behind a computer all day and you just maybe do a bit of research online, try and get a phone number and see if somebody will talk to you, and then you just kind of plug it out. If the industry paid more, that might have some influence in your media outlet trying to allow people to get a decent day's wage by only producing one quality story. Again, the investigative journalism has kind of gone out the window. And, again, if you're only going to get one story a week from somebody because they're spending all week long doing research and a bunch of digging into different pieces that make the story complex, is it worth it? I don't think it is anymore, because they can't afford it. They don't have the revenue. But a lot of journalists are also not coming out and working for places with a journalism degree either. If you have a degree in computer science, and or really anything, like, that's all that seems to matter. And then they'll allow the editors to kind of fix up your, maybe some of your English and grammar problems. again, we visited this a little bit earlier. I wish I could give a better answer, but the schools have to do a better job, and I don't know if they are, because the instructors, I'm going to guess, the reason that they are producing a lot more activists is because they're activists themselves now. The whole culture of virtually everything, like, you're more, you'd identify yourself more from a conservative standpoint of at least what the boundaries are under that definition. But I found that a lot of conservatives don't want to get into politics because they've got their business, their job, their family, their commitments, and the pool to draw from has not been as big. Where, you take school boards, for example, at least a story that I wrote on that. One of the things I found out, or I was told, is the unions are the ones that pre-select a lot of the candidates, and then they help fund them so that they get more name recognition, and often they're the ones that get elected. So from the other side of the political and cultural spectrum, there's more people that are willing to change their job, or leave where their commitments are behind, because from the standpoint of what matters to them about society and their activist role, politics is one of the ways that they feel they can make a difference, and they'll step into that arena. So
Yeah.
journalism is facing that right now, I sense, as well. And so, you have to get a structural change. When I was taught, we'd have a post-mortem on our newspaper, for example, and the instructor, they'd go through every story, and they would be so determined, even if a story was well written and the photo was great and everything, they had to find things to criticize us for, and really to try and push us and show where we could have done better. And we go out into the real world, and now we're a little better prepared, but we still have to fall on our face and fail, and sometimes, and learn from that. That's not happening now, largely because, like I said, our adversaries aren't going to talk to us because of the outlet we work for. So we're kind of getting just the friendly sort of interviews, and again, we're not getting a lot of pushback when we're writing or reporting a story. That whole aspect has disappeared in such a large way. So we as journalists are no longer accountable either. So if there's a way to bring that back, and I'm not sure what it is. Again, if we took the money away that the federal government is giving out to a lot of these outlets, I think that'll give, a come to Jesus moment to a lot of these places, because they're going to be reliant on, or they're budgeting with that money in mind, and they'll have to decide how they're going to move forward if they're going to stay relevant or viable. That's one way we can move, but we have to find some way to get anybody that's coming into the industry the opportunity to learn how to do the job, and you know be accountable, be like there, people are getting encouraged and promoted when they do something that promotes a particular viewpoint that's important. We saw it with Trump all the time. If you did something that reported something that was incorrect, pretty soon you're probably getting your own column once a week or something like this. Whereas if I screwed up the name on a photograph that I took and it got published, like if I did that a couple of times, I might be losing my job. And that was, that, that you made your outlet look bush league when you would have these little errors, let alone a big one where you're telling something that's completely wrong. But that's not that's that whole accountability thing is disappeared from our newsrooms. And yeah, and pretty soon, if we're not careful, we're going to find that our government is going to decide that Epoch Times, Counter Signal, True North, a lot of the ones that are reporting about the government and giving the Trudeau administration pushback, they're going to be labeled as having disinformation, and that's I think on the horizon. And pretty soon, then you're only going to have the media friendly outlets that are allowing these scandals and these bad policies and things like that without having any scrutiny. Those are the ones that are the government's looking to survive. That's what I think.
I was laughing near the end there because I was born in Iran and we had to flee the country because it was turning, everything was going to hell. And we're kind of approaching that. We're not executing people in the streets yet, but like the media is, it's really, it's getting to the point where it's starting to look like Iran, where the person comes on TV is like, the American economy is collapsing, America's in demise, and it's just all lies and everybody knows it. They're just ridiculing the state media, kind of like our CBC.
That happened when your family was in
Anyway,
Iran. Like there was all
well, there was
Baghdad
a
Bob
revolution
kind
in
of stuff.
'79.
Yeah, but I mean,
Uh,
you've heard your family
yeah, my
talk
point
about the
was
media from Iran, right?
right.
Yeah, and so was it more or less state sponsored media?
Yeah, well, Iran, it is state sponsored. I'm sure there are private media, but if they run afoul of the religious clergy,
Mhm.
they'll just come and shoot them in the head or something. They'll
Ooh,
throw them in jail
okay, yeah.
forever. So they have actual state sponsored media, whereas here in Canada, they're trying to do it in a much more professional, much less, I don't know, monstrous kind of manner, where we're going to pass this law that'll make it impossible to get real media. We're going to come up with this weaponized word called disinformation that didn't exist 4 years ago, and we're just going to keep blasting it like go bowls and until people believe it.
Hmm. I mean, what do you think? I mean,
Anything.
I I I try not to read or consume too much news, especially in BC, because it's a terrible landscape we have here. But much of Canada is not very credible, I feel, or professional. I mean, when you're consuming news, what is it that you're finding? And I mean, I think you have a high profile on X, and so maybe you can gain sort of the temperature from a particular story across the country. But I mean, what is it that you're finding when it comes to media?
I think we've sort of been on a journey. So the Trump era, people were kind of like, what's going on? It's two camps. I think it was Harvard. They released a study that said 96% of German news was biased against Trump. All the other ones in the U.S. was 80% biased. So there was a huge bias.
Mhm.
And then after 2020, the turmoil with the elections, people were really angry. This led to the trucker convoy as well. People were angry. You, Jeff, told me how um, you've noticed a decline in comments on Epoch Times, and I think that's because when people were angry and they didn't know how to channel that anger into political change, they went on Epoch Times and start commenting Trudeau's, he's evil, he's a communist. But we are kind of seeing some positives. I think Telegram is a positive. So a lot of people are creating their own news channel on Telegram because you can do that with zero budget. One of where I get my main source of news is this Telegram channel, this independent Canadian citizen. All he does is he's got contacts around the world. Spain. I knew about the Spain protests before most of the media was talking about it because it showed up on this guy's Telegram channel. Um, and it's really phenomenal because he puts both pro Hamas and pro Israeli stuff on there. And somebody called him out on it. He's like, listen, this is the way media works. I'm going to put it here. If you disagree with it, move on. So I think that's how I get my news, and that's what I feel is happening. It's progress.
Hmm. Well, it's good. I've heard others actually feel like we are going to be moving into a more legitimate era of journalism as well. But I mean, I'm kind of the wet blanket on that. I don't see that. And I think about in particular, you know, there is in the 80s, there was a famine in Ethiopia and all kinds of, it was a war that was man created and is terrible. But we didn't have 24-hour news coverage, but we've all seen the photo that came out of that, where you had a child emaciated, crying with a vulture in the background. And the guy took the picture and demonstrated to the world how bad this was. And it was had such an impact that there were concerts and fundraising, and countries just started, flooding Ethiopia with food and resources and efforts to try and stop the war and all that stuff. Even in that age where social media did not exist, the backlash that guy got for taking that picture led him to commit suicide. And we have an era now where maybe people are getting, I guess, I don't want to say they're getting a thicker skin, because that's definitely not true, but at least the people that are giving them thumbs up and supportive comments are outweighing the negative ones, because you're only getting people that kind of agree with you. But we're also missing huge stories that used to matter to the entire world. I think right now, if I don't have a lot of, I can't find much on it, but I think Armenia is going through a genocide right now, or sorry, a portion of Armenians that are in Azerbaijan, they have, they're being starved from getting supplies and food and energy, and it's a genocide that looks like is happening there. We don't know anything about it. That used to not be the case, especially in this era where we have cameras and journalists everywhere. But if it's not related to vaccines or Israel or whatever the big talking point that's generating clicks, it's not getting covered. That's a part of the bigger problem that's emerged as well, Payman. Where what we decide is news has shifted, and that photo saved a lot of lives in Ethiopia. I would think one photo like that from this territory, this Armenian territory in Azerbaijan, might do the same thing. But we're getting desensitized to it now. And yeah, we only care about very specific topics. It's, I wish we could change.
Yeah, one last comment I'll make. Somebody told me this, that there's more news today in 24 hours than there was in the entirety of Thomas Jefferson's life. And then you look at like what these activists are accomplishing, nothing, and what Thomas Jefferson accomplished. So I think a lot of it is just noise.
I'd have to think about that one a little bit more, but I would agree that even if it is newsworthy, we get so much of it that our ability to retain a lot of it is probably, yeah, decreased. It's in one ear and out the other in a lot of cases, and so it does maybe act as noise. But we are also getting a limited amount of, I mean, you used to go to, let's say, Fox News, their website, and on their front page they would have a couple of the most important political stories and the most relevant sports story, and an arts and culture story, and you'd have all these different areas that right on the front page for you to kind of, what is it that you're interested in, and here's a big menu for you to choose from. But it's changed now. It's what's going to generate the most, or more than likely there's going to be Trump stories, and there's going to be something negative about Joe Biden or whatever that they're trying to promote. And so we're really tapered into this narrow news feed, and we just don't have a clue on what's going on outside the world or our own little area that's important to us, because these media outlets are deciding that. And not only that, we're continually getting reinforced with what we already think or believe or have heard, and we're not getting more balance on, I mean, what does matter to us. I mean, Israel Hamas is a great example. Like, we're going to get the exact same feeds depending on the side that we're sort of choosing. We don't navigate the different, websites or news options in order to try and get a balanced picture, because we already know we're not getting it from where we're, you know, clicking, or what we're getting on our from our newspaper or whatever, right? So yeah, you're probably right. Noise is what the majority of our news is now. And unless we sit here and we talk about a particular story with somebody who agrees with us, it might not even be retained either. Yeah, good point.
So, Jeff, we're approaching the 90-minute mark. I guess just to wrap things up, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I I've often thought I should publish something that shows all of the sort of deception that media does, from inflammatory headlines and butchered quotes, and you know up to bigger things on the influence of advertisers, or some of these outlets that or not outlets but organizations that are like sleeping giants and Media Matters for America, which are there to try and damage advertising revenue for conservative websites. It, yeah, that's a story for another day, I think. So I think I would just like to conclude myself by saying it was a privilege to be here with you and talk with you. And whatever journey you are taking in politics, I hope you learn a lot and you can connect with a lot of people. And anybody that's going to be covering you, I would hope that they're going to do it in a professional and balanced manner. So much success to you in that avenue too, sir.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on. I always have a blast chatting with you. So, thank you for volunteering your time.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good night. Bye.
Good night.